Hello and welcome to Superpower Broadcasting. My name is Kevin Castley. Thank you for being with us tonight. Tonight, we are going to be discussing and debunking the bogus narrative that's put forth by Putin and his henchmen to essentially argue that it was the Soviet Union, it was Joseph Stalin that saved the West from fascism in the Second World War, or as they refer to it in Russia as the Great Patriotic War. This is a bogus narrative. Yesterday on the stream, we commemorated the 75th anniversary of the victory in Europe against fascism and the defeat of Nazi Germany and its its allies in Europe. However, it was pointed out by Anthony, who is on the panel tonight, that Europe itself, Eastern Europe especially, was not liberated until 1991, and Russia, of course, has never been liberated. There's this idea that just because the Soviet Union was part of the Allies, and because they lost by far the most soldiers from any of the Allied nations, that somehow that makes them heroic. It makes Stalin a good guy. It makes, by that virtue, Putin a good guy who has embraced the legacy of Stalin. No, that's bogus. It's worth noting, it's imperative that we note here, that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed in 1939, and it basically saw the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany cooperate for 2 years, and it wasn't, of course, until 1941 that Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, and then all of a sudden the Soviet Union basically became part of the Allies, and the United States went into the war in 1941 as well. But there's an important point to note here, which is that the Soviet Union went into the war against Hitler not because they were necessarily that ideologically opposed to Hitler. The documentary The Soviet Story actually does a really good job of pointing out and citing documents, original primary sources, documents between the ministers in both regimes that showed that they had a great sense of camaraderie between each other in terms of perfecting their butcher machines against their populations. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, well, yes, they had some fundamental ideological differences, and it was probably inevitable that they were going to war at some point. For those 2 years, the Soviets and Hitler were basically, for all intents and purposes, partners, right? And it doesn't make you a hero if you're also a genocidal maniac, but then the genocidal maniac that you're working with stabs you in the back and invades you, so then you go and fight him. That doesn't make you the good guy. That just means that you're a bad guy who got screwed over. That's what tends to happen with these gangs of thugs, is they backstab each other, they betray each other. And Hitler betrayed Stalin. The thing is here, that is, as I said, that doesn't make Stalin a good guy. And yes, the Soviet Union had a huge, monumental death toll in that war. We're talking 28 million to 34 million, depending on which estimate you go with, between 1941, the summer of 1941, and May of 1945. In other words, about 47 months, 27 to 34 million people dead. So roughly, it works out to, when I did the calculation before, I think it was 5 people per minute died every minute for those 4 years in the Soviet Union on average. That's horrific. That's like the end of the world. It was like 15% of their population. However, that wasn't some great act of heroism relative to the West. That was because the Soviet system viewed humans as basically cannon fodder and disposable, and they marched people into the war with basically no ammo, in many cases, not even working rounds or working guns rather, and they were literally cannon fodder against the Nazis, and so that's not some impressive sort of thing. Those people were victims of Stalin just as much as they were victims of Hitler in that sense. Because I can tell you that if the United States, if FDR had been leading the Soviet Union, that there would not have been 28 to 34 million casualties. A capitalist democracy would simply not operate in the same way. There would have been millions of dead, and it would have been entirely on Hitler in that case. But Stalin screwed over the Russian people just as much in that sense. And so, yeah, Jaeger's pointing out in the chat, Soviet human bullet catchers. That's exactly what it was. They had hordes of communists and people that were forced to do the bidding of the communists that they marched in, and it was all to save Stalin's butt at the end of the day. And of course, it worked. But this revisionist narrative that you see touted by people such as Vladimir Putin, as well as their water boys in the West. I'm talking about people like Stephen Cohen, the notorious, infamous disgrace of a professor. I'm talking about, Noam Chomsky. I'm talking about Kremlin Kyle Kulinski. I'm talking about Jimmy Dore. I'm talking about Abby Martin. I'm talking about Tulsi Gabbard. The list goes on and on. The usual suspects that would claim that we owe this bit of thanks and gratitude to Stalin, and thereby to extend that to Putin for saving us from fascism. Rather, no, the fascism of the day was vanquished in part due to the contributions by the Soviet Union. But let's bear in mind that the logistical support and a lot of the food that was provided to the Red Army was a direct product of America. America had given the Soviet Union a lot of trucks, weapons, intel, so on and so forth, plus food. It was an alliance in the true sense of the term. Nobody can take individual credit for it. And though there are people out there that would try to say, "Oh, it was a Soviet victory, not an American victory." Well, no, it was both, but it was mostly American at the end of the day in that respect. But when we talk about, and we're going to go to the panel very shortly, but when we talk about the revisionist narrative that's put out there, it serves a current purpose. It's not just about, oh, we need to give thanks to Stalin or whatnot. That would be ridiculous enough. I mean, what's he going to do? Not fight Hitler after Hitler invaded his territory and came for him? That doesn't make him a hero. Just makes him another bad guy that got screwed over. So then he goes over and fights back. It's like, okay, so he won. That's good. Hitler is obviously the greater evil in the context of things, but that doesn't make Stalin a good guy. However, all those people that are out there making that narrative, and you'll see it all the time. I went to university. I took several courses on modern Russia as well as the history of the Soviet Union. A lot of the professorship, a lot of the students that are interested in this sort of stuff, as well as just people that take this isolationist stance in foreign policy, when they talk about how we owe thanks to Soviets and we owe thanks to Stalin, that current effect of that, the practical effect of that, it goes beyond just remembering something in some abstract sense. It directly legitimizes Putin because, of course, Putin has attached himself to the legacy of Stalin. Of course, and we could talk about this in another stream, but it's worth noting he's also attached himself to the legacy of the Tsars. And of course, Stalin and the Tsars were not the biggest fans of each other. I mean, they fought a war against each other, right? But in this era of cringe, you can think the Tsar was based in Tradcon and red pilled, and think that Stalin was based in Tradcon and red pilled, and be a monarchist and a communist at the same time, and a fascist. That this is modern Russia. This is the binge of cringe that is the modern Russian Federation. Of course, I call it fascist Russia because, to wrap this up here, the introduction stage, at least, of this is that in 1991, all that changed was that the Cold War never ended. The Soviet Union was defeated, was vanquished in large part due to the Reagan administration, but as well all the presidents up to that point that had maintained Truman's containment policy. However, the Kremlin merely swapped out communism for fascism. There was no fundamental liberalization that occurred in Russia. And so it went from being Soviet Russia to fascist Russia. And, to make the sort of final point here, this is a regime that, sure, you can do your apologetics for them. You can sing the praise. You can talk about how Putin's based and all this stuff. But chances are you're on the internet saying that type of stuff, and you're a fan of these people like Sargon and all these other people out there who have made these kinds of points. Jill Stein, Nigel Farage, so on and so forth. You're probably living in a Western city, or at least in a suburb of a Western city, or rural outskirts that's still close enough to the fireball and the radiation that you would still probably die. I got news, dudes. You can think Putin's based and all this stuff and everything. They're practicing nuking your city right now. I mean, they have multiple submarine launched ballistic missile subs out there. Big. They call them boomers in the Navy. That's the term for. I mean, I know it's a meme. That's that's actually the term for these submarines. They practice nuking cities like San Diego, Victoria, New York, London, Bristol. It goes on and on and on and on. It runs the gamut. And are there pro-Russian people in all of these cities? Absolutely. And will they nuke them too? Absolutely. They don't care, because in fact, they see those people. They see, and this goes back to Yuri Bezmenov, the KGB mastermind type figure who really revealed to the West a lot of the tactics and culture in the KGB. He spoke about how the KGB, they referred to their communist sympathizers in the West as useful idiots, and they had less respect for them than they even did the American patriots, because they're like, hey, look, the Americans, they're our enemy, dude. But I mean, those guys, at least they have honor and they protect their own country. Really? We're going to work with these people that were willing to sell out their own country? It's like, no, they're useful for now, but if we ever win, they're getting shot too, because they sided with us instead of fighting for their own country. So how can we trust them? I got news, dudes. That's what your hero Putin thinks of you. In other words, if he wins, you're going to be rounded up and shot because you were disloyal to your own country. So why would he have him, or why would he have you in his country? Think about it. You want to talk about being based and red-pilled and all this stuff? Get some loyalty to your own nation. So at the end of the day, they're practicing nuking your hometown right now and incinerating all of your friends. They have 8,000 nuclear weapons pointed at you. So to wrap this up, this narrative to rehabilitate and give honor and lavish the praise upon Stalin, that is the direct agenda of Putin's regime, to legitimize the Putin system and to delegitimize the West, our civilization. And here on this channel, we are ardent, unapologetic defenders of the Western order and our civilization. And with that, we're going to go to the panel. We welcome tonight a new guest here. We have Curious Punjabi. You can follow him over on Twitter at I believe it's Indic Atheist. And we also have Anthony Roberto. Be sure to follow him on Twitter as well at Global Affairs. And so with that, thanks for coming on. Welcome to the program, Curious Punjabi. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How about you, Kevin?
I'm kind of fired up. We had a pretty, more somber stream last night, but tonight I really want to get into just debunk the bunk and junk narrative out there that tries to use the horrors of World War II to legitimize and perpetuate new horrors in our century, perpetrated by Putin against Europe and the West. So yeah.
May I suggest at the first talking point that people like to bring up? I bring up the fact that Hitler and Stalin agreed in 1939 to partition Poland, and and that was with their non-aggression pact.
Mm-hmm.
And if Hitler didn't betray Stalin, the Soviet Union would not have been a front at all, which was the entire reason for the non-aggression pact. Uh, Victory Day was, and that Victory Day was the result of the combined forces of the Allies on many fronts. It was a total war. Stalin
Yeah.
only acted against Hitler because Hitler betrayed their non aggression pact in 1941. Had Hitler not attacked, they would have worked together to carve up Europe.
Yes.
But then, but people usually uh, rebut that with, would the USA get involved with in World War II had Pearl Harbor not happened? So I think that's the first point to debunk for the day.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And the thing about that Pearl Harbor point, the thing that's worth noting there is that the main reason preventing American involvement earlier on was the isolationist movement. They called themselves America Firsters. They basically wanted to let Hitler take over Eurasia essentially because they thought America is the only thing that mattered. And of course, FDR and Truman and all the presidents that followed up until Trump now, you know, you could argue Obama was pretty isolationist, but Trump is formally, or I should say formally, embraced the term America First, which was an isolationist movement that was pro-Hitler, literally. And so it's been thoroughly discredited, that idea, because it was so apparent that America benefited tremendously you know, involving herself in the world and going on to become the hegemon of the world. That is inarguably a victory for America. And the America Firsters turned out to be the America Lasters, and they were Hitler Firsters. And just as the most proud, vocal America Firsters that support Donald Trump, that are even more isolationist than Donald Trump, like Nick Fuentes, they're actually Russia Firsters, right? And at the end of the day, yeah, they were an impediment, but you got to keep in mind that it was inevitable at some point that America was going to come into it as well. I mean, it's very possible that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were going to work with each other for longer. But as I did say in the intro, there were still fundamental disagreements. I mean, Hitler was inspired by Lenin. He was inspired by the labor movement, the communist movement, in particular the Bolsheviks. That's why he made his flag mostly red and so on. And a lot of his rhetoric was about getting rid of classism and having, you know, one German working class, this whole idea. A lot of it was inspired by Bolshevism, but he hated what he saw in Bolshevism as this sort of Jewish element and so on. And so his greatest enemy at the end of the day was still the Soviet Union. But that doesn't make the Soviet Union the good guys, because you can be, and this is something that if you're watching this and you're somebody who hasn't really thought about it too much before, you've just kind of taken the internet memes for granted. I got news. You can be equally opposed to communism and fascism. You don't have to say, well, I hate fascism, so I'm going to do apologetics for communism. You don't have to do that. You can be against them both. Churchill was against them both, right? So with that, we're going to go to Anthony. Thanks for coming on. How are you doing tonight?
Pretty good. I mean, I think the only side you should be rooting for is the Western Allies. I mean, why would you
Yeah.
root for anybody else? I mean, that's just kind of cringe. I mean, that's just like Westphalian trash. I mean, you would want to, root for the British, Canadians, Americans, Australians, and stuff like that. Like, why would you support people who aren't a part of the free world? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. It's like, dude, you're Canadian. Dude, you're British. Don't you want to feel like a little proud? I mean, I'm not saying like you have to be like a nationalist, but it's like, yeah, your country helped free the world. Like, why do you have to give the Soviets so much like credit? And it's like yeah, like they deserve credit for, I guess, like, removing the Nazis, because obviously Nazis
Yeah.
are bad people. But at the same time, I mean, just look at the post-world order. I mean, like, if you look at Czechoslovakia, Poland, or Hungary, they rigged all those elections. They killed all the capitalist parties. They butchered people.
They
I
killed
know,
their
I
own
know,
communist sympathizers.
and not only that though, but I know in Poland, there was a Jewish refugee who gave his speech months ago, and she told us how she actually lost family members who died because what happened was Soviet troops were border guards, and they were trying to cross into Austria, I think, and some of them got killed or whatever. So yeah, like things like that happen because again, like Soviet border troops, they don't care, or really the Soviet army in general doesn't really care. They also raped a bunch of women in Germany. Like I mean, we can go down the list of things. I mean, it's a Slavic nationalist kind of country. I mean, think about it. Like, do you think like the Turkmen, Tajiks, or other ethnicities in Russia? Do you think those people got a lot of power? No, they didn't. I mean, I mean, it's it really was like a racist state, and it's like these people don't think that. It's like just because they didn't have black people there doesn't mean that they weren't racist. Like,
Well,
it's such a stupid lie. It's the same thing like Hassan Piker. I remember I
yeah,
listened to like last year he had this stream and he was debating someone. He was like, "Well, at least the USSR wasn't racist." I'm like, "Dude, they were racist." And like if there was black people there, they would do the same exact thing. Like, are you kidding me? Like these people are just as susceptible to the same kind of racial um things as we are in America. So yeah, like they weren't
yeah.
liberating the world at all. Like these people are going after their own agendas, So I
Well,
just think it's such a bunch of bunk and junk meme. And
yeah,
yeah, just
yeah.
awful.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Just a small note on that, though, that's worth noting here, because I know that there's this whole meme and everything that Stalin embraced Russian chauvinism, and he had the line about recognizing the great Russian people as basically the masters of the Soviet Union and all this. He did kill more Russians per capita than, like, I believe any of the other Soviet territories. And so if you were Russian under Stalin, you were more likely to be worse off than in some of the outlying areas. And so they were sure racist against Tatars and so many different groups. We lost the connection with Anthony, but he'll be back shortly once that's reestablished. So many other groups they were absolutely racist against, and of course Stalin led so many pogroms against Jews and so on. But unlike a traditional sort of two-tiered sort of racist sort of state, like an apartheid state, like say South Africa, where if you were black you were going to lose, and if you were white you were going to win in that situation. If you were in the Soviet Union, yes, the state was racist against all the minorities, but even if you were in that great Russian group, you were purged and starved and everything. In other words, nobody won. The only person who won at the end of the day was the leader. And on this note, I just want to make a clarification before we go and hear from Anthony Avis Dubuisson, who's just joining the stream tonight. Welcome to the show. With that, I just wanted to say that this isn't to take away the heroism and the credit and the bravery and the valor of the Red Army soldiers that did kill Nazis and the generals that led them. Obviously, Zhukov and others deserve a lot of credit. But the point here is to give the credit and the valor to the individual heroes, not to the Soviet system that made their life a living hell and sent about 94 to 95% of those who were combat aged males at the time to their deaths in that 4 year span. But I mean, keep in mind, 30 million people plus in a country, 150 million people, that's catastrophic. I mean, that would be the equivalent of if this COVID disease that's going around killed about 60 million Americans, 65 million Americans, right, in 4 years. That's how big of a disaster this was. It's not to take away the heroism of them. It's to simply say that it's a disgrace to their legacy, to their valor in fighting fascism, for us to make apologetics on a system that sent them to the gulag after they were victorious because they had, quote, seen the West. And Stalin didn't trust them to reintegrate into society. These are Soviet heroes. These are Red Army heroes that were sent to the gulag to starve because they had seen what the world looked like outside the Soviet Union. Really? We're going to give credit to communism? No, we give credit there to the Red Army soldiers, not to the ideology of the Red Army. But with that, we're going to go to Anthony Avis Dubuisson. Thanks for coming on the program tonight.
Thank you for having me on the program this time, Kevin. I just wanted to say that as you mentioned, it's good that you make a note of that, because 11 million, around about 11 million USSR forces died actually fighting to destroy the Nazi regime. However, we must acknowledge that a lot of the commands that Stalin gave, especially the commissars that assisted many of these forces, they used what we call I think it's the equivalent of Dutch courage, essentially telling troops to keep moving forward and not to go back. And if they go back, they would have like about 11 of them shot. It was a vicious kind of system where these forces, just by the sheer number of them, they were pushed up against the Nazi regime, and they were told by commissars, which were essentially you could say the local propaganda officers, to keep moving forward for the glory of Russia and for the Soviet Union and glory of Stalin. But we just must acknowledge that point, not only that there were forces who fought against Nazi Germany and should be acknowledged for their sacrifices, but that the USSR, the Soviet regime under Stalin, was very vicious towards these troops and was very careless, really, with their lives.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely. That's an important point to note there, of course, is that the communists, the political commissars that were there, they were there for two purposes, basically. The first was to make sure that the Red Army conscripts had their dose of Marx and Stalin and Lenin. And the second was, if they retreated, even strategically retreated, they would be shot. And there is something that's worth noting here, because there's often this sort of meme that the fascists will portray of the Nazis as this marauding, this based warrior culture of these blitzkriegers that came in. But the reality of the situation, the mechanized columns that they like to show in all of their memes and stuff, the reality of the situation for the Germans as well was most all of them in the Wehrmacht and everything else, they were on horseback. There were some tanks and some very high-tech planes up at the front that did like the shock and awe stuff, but they were still mostly an army that would not have been out of place in the 1850s. And so in that sense, they just had rifles, but their logistics were also poorly thought out, because of course Hitler didn't really think things through too well in that sense. So Hitler and Stalin both did similar tactics to that, basically just march through hordes of people and tell them to keep going on with very little in the way of resources, and then have the propaganda basically portray them as invincible, when in reality, the only reason why the Soviets were able to really come through on that was because the Soviet Union was just so much larger. I mean, 150 million people against Germany.
Can I just say that I want to just give an example, sorry, to highlight your point of, you could say, poor German or Nazi German strategies, was that I believe it was in the early 1940s when they were marching their way towards Stalingrad. Hitler wanted to split up the army between Stalingrad and the Caucasus. So he told the general at the time, Friedrich Paulus, to essentially have half the army go to Stalingrad and half the army go to the Caucasus. And this is at a time when the logistical lines were getting strained already. So it just gives you an example that even from Hitler's perspective and from Nazi Germany and their Nazi forces, is that they were also feeding into poor tactics and poor strategy. But that's just a small point to highlight your other point.
Oh, for sure, and that's the grand scheme of things here, is that at the end of the day, it was the decisions of two individuals that determined the fates of about 45 to 50 million people in Europe in that war. And so I know a lot of people talk about, how it's kind of wrong, that it's somehow arrogant or whatnot to view history through the lens of individual actors. But let's be honest, Hitler and Stalin, they called the shots in that war, right? And Hitler, of course, made a lot of blunders. Stalin made some blunders too, but they weren't as consequential for him because he had so many more tens of millions of people to conscript that he could make it up.
Can I just also add one last thing before you throw it to the rest of the panel? We must remember that the Eastern Front, especially during World War II, was an ideological war. In other words, it was a total war the true sense of the word, where you had not only the horrors of you could say unknown Holocaust. So I call it the unknown Holocaust. It's just the period of time before the actual industrialized Holocaust with Auschwitz and that, where the Nazis were trying out how to kill Jews essentially with Einsatzgruppen and that. What we have to remember is that on the Eastern Front was a total war. We're talking about all citizens as well as soldiers, as well as the whole arms of government being mobilized for war. Not only from the Nazi side, but also the Soviet side, because the Nazis viewed the Soviets as barbarians. The Soviets viewed the Nazis as a menace to their country and their nation. We have to realize that it's a completely different war in the Eastern Front as a comparison to the Western Front. The Western Front was a bit more classical, a bit more civil. I mean, if you were a French prisoner and you were not a Jew, you would not be treated as bad. There's someone who was from Ukraine and who was Jewish, or even a partisan, you would not be treated as bad in terms of if you were a prisoner of war. So we must just acknowledge that these were two different fronts, and their methods were much more extreme. The Eastern Front, it was a total war with ideology and so forth.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was a true total war in that sense. I mean, Hitler. I mean, what Hitler did, we have to keep in mind, right, that it wasn't just, even as you say, also the ideological component. That's worth pointing out, because there have been wars between countries that have been very brutal, but their ideologies were still, roughly similar or analogous to each other. They just were fighting over resources or whatever. And in this case, there was a real fundamental difference between the ideology that Hitler had for National Socialism versus Stalin in terms of communism, and they really disagreed on a matter of the fate of what would become of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, because of course Hitler's plan for that was that if he succeeded in it, he had a doctrine of what he called Lebensraum, which was that he wanted living space for the German people, what he defined as the German people. And so he wasn't going to make puppet states out of these areas. He wasn't going to have, legitimized puppets from the locals. He was going to murder the Slavic people, exterminate them, and then have Germans go over there and then start running the farms and stuff. And so he did have a plan to enslave some people, but as for Ukrainians and as for Russians and so on, they were all to be exterminated. And so in that sense, it was also a total war in the sense of what it meant to be alive from a racial standpoint too, because it was a total war between Aryan-dominated Europe exclusively, essentially, versus this plurality type system, this system of communism, where sure there's a racial component to it, absolutely, that was Russian chauvinism, but Russian chauvinism never got to the extent of German chauvinism in that war. Stalin was never out there saying, we're going to exterminate everybody who's not Slavic. He just wanted to enslave everybody who wasn't Slavic, basically, and he enslaved the Slavs too. But Hitler actually wanted to exterminate them all, and that was his plan. And when some of the Ukrainians, like Bandera and some of the other leaders that were trying to use their alliance with Hitler to gain some ground in the independence movement, Hitler could have he could have given himself a big advantage by giving them some autonomy, some chance of self-rule within Ukraine that they had been fighting for a long time against the communists. But he didn't. He had them rounded up and shot, the leaders and all their followers. A lot of them were rounded up and shot. And you think, well, they were his allies. They were fighting for him. And then they just wanted a bit of autonomy. Why would he do that? And it's like, because he had no intention of there ever being a German puppet state in Ukraine. The idea was he was going to murder all the Ukrainians and then have Germans go and live there. So that was the end goal for him. So.
Well, I think the other thing that speaks a lot of volumes too is I think it was in 43 or 44 where there was the Polish uprising in the ghettos, and the Soviet army just stood there across the river, just sitting there and just waiting until it was over to then go in.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, they eventually went into Warsaw,
1944.
but they waited until after the battle was after. And the thing was, like, those Polish people, they actually held out for a couple of weeks, I believe.
Yeah.
And the Russians just sat there, just waiting. They no support whatsoever. They just sat there like that's the Soviet
Yes.
army.
And but those Poles were pro-socialist. Like the leaders in that movement were socialists that were inspired by Marx and Lenin, but Stalin saw them as a power threat. So he wanted them to be wiped out. He basically wanted the Germans and them to fight each other, to weaken each other, so that he could have absolute power in the end, right? So that's another point about this that gets lost on a lot of people is like, you don't get brownie points with Putin. You don't get brownie points with Stalin if you sympathize with them. They have less respect for you for sympathizing with them and going against your own country in that sense. And this is a more broad point about fifth columnary than they do for patriots. I mean, Stalin, as well as all the Soviet leaders, they had more respect for people like Ronald Reagan and their supporters than they did for the communist sympathizers, because they're like, well, those people aren't trustworthy. Like they say they're with us. It's like, are we going to trust them? How we know we're not spies? They're not spies.
And
right?
on top of that, if I can just speak one more time, is that for the Soviets, they also had the one step back policy, which was what Anthony was explaining earlier. I believe the estimate was like over 100,000 to 200,000, I believe, of how many people actually died just because they retreated. Like if you retreated by a couple of steps, there were specialized officers that just shot their infantry because you can only move forward. You couldn't move back. If you move, you can only move back under obviously certain commands, but if you just like retreated because of like strategic or tactical reasons or whatever, in a lot of cases you were just shot and killed by that, because there'd be people that would literally stand behind just to shoot at infantry if they were retreating. Like that's how horrible it was. And it's like the other thing too is that it's like, some infantrymen didn't even have guns. Some of them didn't have enough ammo. As you mentioned, a lot of them had to walk on foot. A lot of them took trains, that were really dirty, that were awful, and there was just, like so many different problems on the Eastern Front as far as like supplies go. And it's like, well, we supplied the Soviets with a lot of stuff. And it's like, yeah, they were pretty brutal. Food rations were extremely thinned out. And I mean, like really stretched out per soldier in the front lines. And it's like, like a lot of soldiers just starved and died. Like even if you didn't get like shot or killed, you would just die from like hypothermia or something like that.
Oh yeah.
But like that's the scary part. Like you might even never even see action before you died.
Oh no, absolutely, absolutely, and that's another thing about this is that the food aid that America did provide, a lot of people that were in the Soviet Union. I've spoken with like professors and whatnot who said that their parents or grandparents who had been fighting in the war, they remember the Americans as basically the guys that gave them food, because they would eat American, like they were rationed out, but it was American food made in the USA, like meat and stuff, and yet we're supposed to give Stalin like the credit. I mean, because again, this whole idea to remember the sacrifice of the USSR, all this sort of stuff. It's a politically charged talking point that's meant to, in the context of today, legitimize Putin. It's not about honoring or respecting the valor of those who actually killed the Nazis. Those were individual people who were fighting. Yeah, they were fighting for their motherland, of course. They were fighting for their families. But almost all of them were not fighting for communism. I mean, it was a small percentage of the commissariat, some of the true believers and stuff that bought into it. But most people were there because they were born in the USSR. Hitler invaded, it came for their families, and they wanted revenge, right? So, and they deserve our respect and admiration for that, right? Because they went over there and they obviously they brought hell upon the Nazis. Like that's another thing, is that after things went bad for Hitler, what we need to remember is kind of like what Anthony Avistubi-Sun was saying about the civility on the Western Front. It went both ways on the Eastern Front. Once the Soviets had the upper hand, Germany was literally raped and pillaged, right? So, I mean, they had no civility the other way around. And sure, some people could say, well, the Americans were the same way with Japan. They nuked Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but I would argue that that was nowhere near close, because those were still military depots and stuff that the Americans targeted. So
Right. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like I think people forget that like people on on other sides obviously committed war crimes as well. It wasn't just the Nazis, and also as you mentioned too, the starving of Ukrainians and other ethnic minorities as well. It's like they didn't have much pride in them. They didn't even treat Jews very well either.
yeah,
It's like there's a lot of stories of hidden children and stuff like that. On the on the Western Front, but also on the Eastern Front too, where they tried to
yeah.
settle and stuff like that. And I mean, they weren't as prone, but like
Well,
if they were caught doing
And
something, they could be killed for being Jewish too.
what I'll say though is that obviously this stream, my channel, my work and whatnot is extremely critical of communism and the Soviet Union and Stalin. But what I will say is that there are some people out there who they will be quick to condemn what the Red Army did in Germany in terms of the plundering and everything else. This is controversial here. I understand why what happened. Hitler shouldn't. They shouldn't have had like. I get why the Allies bombed Dresden. I get why the Soviets plundered Germany and extracted all the wealth and brought it back to Moscow. I mean, if you start a total war and you lose a total war, you lose everything. That's kind of the name of the game. So Hitler knew what he was getting into. So
can I just say I want to add to that, to Kevin, sort of I'll highlight your point and sort of add a little, I should say I'll add a caveat to this. We have to remember that with Hitler, he would rather have wanted to surrender to the West. He would have rather wanted to surrender to the Allies, Britain and America. And he was actually he wanted his officers to hold out as long as he could until, he didn't, of course, didn't want any of Nazi Germany to fall, of course. But if he had to choose between either the Soviets or the rest of the Allies, he would have chosen the rest of the Allies. That's why, for example, you had Hitler Youth. Young Hitler Youth, and I remember this. Goebbels made a speech in 1945 where he said that he wanted all the people to give up their lives for Nazi Germany, or give up their lives for the state, both the elderly and the young. So that's why, for example, in the fighting of actual Berlin itself, when it came down to the really nitty gritty, they had Hitler Youth, even like essentially children, fighting on defend Nazi Germany. They were killing all those who wanted to try defect or try run away. They were doing the most brutal of tactics while the Red Army was coming up and bombing the hell out of that city. Because it's almost like it reminds me of the siege of Raqqa, and I'll tell you why it reminds me of the siege of Raqqa. Because when it comes to the siege of Raqqa, ISIS turned that place into a rat trap. It's essentially the same as what the Nazi Germany did with Berlin. They turned that into a rat trap where it was not going to be a simple thing of, okay, we're going to take a strategic post and therefore, it's all over. What we had instead is that you have the whole of essentially the civilians and the military working together essentially to fight against an existential threat, because literally people thought, especially the most devout of the higher Nazi echelons, even Goebbels' family, that they thought that their whole lives were going to come to an end. That when the Soviet Union came in, that they thought that their children would be raped, they thought their way of life would be ending. And when you have that mentality, this is the people in ISIS when it came to the siege of Iraq. When you have people with that mentality, they will defend to the death their right, to, their ideology, and that's why we saw, if you will, the whole wide-scale destruction of Berlin. And I honestly believe if the Americans had come in, they would at least been a bit more sympathetic to the Americans. They would have probably given up a bit more easier to the Americans. But with the Soviets, they genuinely believe that this is essentially the devil's come now to take over their lives and to kill their children, to rape them, and so on. It's that kind of mentality.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's an important thing here to note, is that in the Battle of Berlin, somewhere around 800,000 people were killed. And it was, in the grand scheme of things, it was needless. And you can say, well, all death might be technically needless and war, whatever. But no, at that point, it was 100% guaranteed that the USSR was going to win. The Battle of Berlin didn't need to happen. The same result would have been assured had Hitler just surrendered. But of course, it wasn't an option. And so there is footage, as you mentioned, from Hitler in 1945, where he's inspecting the troops. And it's all like 12-year-olds and 9-year-olds and stuff. And it's one of the last videos of Hitler. and he's there and he's like patting them on the shoulder and he's like, you know, you're gonna die to save my bud or whatever. But of course he knew he was still gonna lose, so they weren't really saving his bud. It was a final sacrifice to the system, essentially, to the regime, to his prestige, to his legacy. And the thing is, I just want to make a point here, which is that the Battle of Berlin was very brutal, but we do need to put things in context. It was still one city that had 800,000 people die, in which the rage and the desire for absolute revenge by the Soviet people was met with the absolute stubbornness of the German high command that was willing to sacrifice their nation to save some sense of face against all hope. That saw 800,000 people die in one small city. Imagine if America had been, oh, using nukes would be bad. We're going to play fair, whatever, and we're going to invade Japan by land. Imagine a whole country now, a country of tens of millions of people, where every woman, every child, every elderly man that's on the island of Honshu and the associated islands is ready to go out there and charge American soldiers with, you know, grenades, sticks, whatever, invented traps, all that kind of stuff. Imagine how brutal it would have been. And so when people try to tell me, oh, they killed 200,000 people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I'm like, do you understand how many millions of people would have died? How many millions and millions more Japanese civilians would have died if the West had to invade Japan by land? Like, I got news. Those nukes saved lives. So that's my view on that.
I think from my history class I had a year ago, I know my modern American history professor, I asked her about, like, did Truman ever regret dropping the bombs? And she told me just he never regretted it. He never did. And he never spoke about it again.
Yeah, he did what he had to do. I mean, it was a total war. Like, I'm sure he probably felt this sense of I wouldn't necessarily say guilt, but he probably felt weird about it. I mean, imagine you've just got the most powerful devices that have ever been produced in all of time in the universe, you know, that we know of at least. And you've used them, and you know that a lot of innocent people, so to speak, are dead now because of it. But, you know, he knew, he's like, well, they shouldn't have started the war. And he also knew, and he also was able to go off into the sunset knowing that, you know, he still saved millions of lives by killing a few 100,000 people. So at the end of the day, it wouldn't honestly even matter, because in that situation, given that his job was president of the United States, he's not going to lose 10,000 extra American troops to save the enemy's lives. That would be beyond his responsibility. His responsibility was to win the war and reduce American casualties. And the best way to do that was to use the super weapon. I mean, it would have been irresponsible to spend all this money and energy into building these weapons and to not use them, and then have millions of people needlessly die in addition to everybody who died, right? It was a quick, easy way to end the war. And the additional benefit was the Soviets knew then that America meant business and was willing to use them on cities. So that's a powerful psychological effect. And I've talked about this before, that I'm pretty sure now, at least, that America's enemies don't think that America would ever actually go through and use the nukes anymore. And I think that's a problem. I'm not saying like America needs to nuke somebody to remind people, but somehow we need to get a leader in place that will make it very clear that the nukes aren't just there for decoration, so we can actually have order in the world instead of Putin invading Crimea and stuff. So that's my view. We'll go to Curious Punjabi, if you've got any thoughts to add, because you haven't spoken in a while.
Okay. Well, people, when I had a debate with a friend of mine named Mehran, and he tells me that the way he sees it, us dropping a atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are war crimes, and thinks that there would have been other ways to get the Japanese to surrender, especially because um, of because Germany was already defeated, and the Japanese were already losing ground. So, what would your counter to that be?
I have the easy.
Had a debate with my buddy on that, and I haven't discussed this with him ever since.
Yeah. No, I've got a very easy counter to that. There's actual video. If you want to see some grim and macabre stuff, you can see there are videos out there from like Iwo Jima and other areas of Japanese citizens that, as the Americans are approaching and they know it's over, they know the war is lost, they go and kill themselves in order to try to kill Americans in the process. There are people talk about the Zero fighters, like the Zero fighters, the kamikaze fighters, those sorts of things. Those planes were not meant to be suicide bombers. They were meant to be like these victorious planes of war that were going to take over the Pacific for Japan and the Emperor. The war wound up going in a different direction. And so those pilots, a part of it, sure, there's some pressure from the regime for you to do this, but not that much. Most of the pressure was a cultural thing. There was a real sense that the emperor was this divine figure, and that the only thing worse than, the thing that was infinitely worse than death was the shame of having to live as a nation in disgrace and surrender. And so it's very clear that if the nukes weren't dropped, and you got to keep in mind, they didn't know. The emperor, they didn't know that America only had 2 nukes. For all they knew, America had another 100 of these things rounded up, and they had no idea what it was. They had no idea. It's not like they were the Soviet Union, where the Soviets had spies at Los Alamos that were informing Stalin the whole time. The Japanese, they had no idea what the nuclear bomb was. And so it was a true shock and awe sort of thing. They were like, what? It leveled a city in one bomb? Okay, we have to surrender now. And so,
Can I just say that we must also remember that really General Tito really ran the Japanese government at that time. Even the emperor was still regarded as a high figure during the war, but we have to remember that when it came to the military structure of the country and the runnings of the structure and running of the army, and that they came under General Tito and his administration. So I just want to remind people of that. The second thing we have to remind people of is that Japan was highly ideological at this time. So as you mentioned the fact that a bit earlier when I was talking about total war, you did mention the fact that they had this very extremist ideology. I can't remember what the exact ideology's name is, but the ideology essentially had gripped the whole of the state. And even this is a lot of Truman's sort of people in the FDR administration, and then of course Truman's administration, they debated this. So we must remember, people, a lot of high officials were debating this. They were saying, okay, how do we do a land invasion? Should we use these bombs that have been tested during the Manhattan Project? How should we go about actually getting rid of this, you could say, the Japanese's wills to fight? And the thing that people forget is that the United States, when it comes to international law perspective, the United States was not signed up, if I recall, to the Hague Tribunal, not the Hague Tribunal, but the Hague Conventions, if I recall. And we're not really signed up to anything in terms of international law that prohibited aerial bombardments of the sort that we saw at Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So we have to remember, at the time, there were no international laws per se against such weaponry. So even from an international legal standpoint, if we look at today's standpoint, probably they would have been illegal. But if we looked at the time, the context of the time, they probably would not have been illegal. And that's the thing we have to remember. So the second thing, and by the way, this is just to address Punjabi and sort of how he would respond to his friend. So the first thing would be that there was no international laws at the time that would prohibited such, you could say, the weaponry and the use of such weaponry. Two, we've got to remember that the Japanese island was highly ideological. That this, as I say, it's the same thing with Soviet Russia versus Nazi Germany. The Japanese imperial state had a very zealous ideological devotion. And remember that after the first bomb was dropped, it took a second bomb, because you see, this is how it worked. First of all, they were trying to negotiate something with those, I remember some Japanese officials. They were trying to negotiate some form of peace, but as I said, it was the arrogance of the Japanese government that did not allow this process to continue. So that's why the bomb was dropped. And it was mostly dropped on, I believe it's the industrial part of Japan. I remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki were industrial hubs for the nation. And third thing is that... Sorry, you go?
You finish, sorry.
So these were industrial hubs for the state, and dropping a bomb on these was, I guess, strategically smart to do, although, of course, the civilian casualty cannot be excused either. So at the end of the day, after they dropped one bomb, the Japanese high command still refused to surrender, so they dropped another bomb. So we just have to remember that this is the kind of stakes that a lot of the Truman officials, as well as the former FDR officials, would have been discussing at the time. So it is, again, if you want to say in terms of modern day, probably would be illegal for modern day standards, of course, but at the time, probably not internationally legal at the time. Yeah.
I think also in the context of the Cold War too. Actually, just one point on that. If we did invade Japan, we would have lost more American lives than all conflicts put together. Some people have estimated it is up to 5 million soldiers we would have lost. You could check it out. Hypothetically, it was called Operation Downfall. It would have been the largest land invasion the U.S. would ever conduct. We would have had over 10 million troops to invade mainland Japan. That would be everything, man. We would have to pull troops out of Europe. That would be everything. And I think on top of that, too, dropping the nuclear weapons, especially the first one, I think you can justify pretty well, is that you were able to show Stalin that, like, hey, we have these nuclear weapons and we're able to use them. Because I think also using the nuclear weapons showed that, like, we weren't going to give up. We had weapons, and you're not going to take over West Germany. So I think also in the Cold War context, we showed Stalin that, like, hey, you're not going to cross our line. Well, you're not going to cross that.
Can I just say, to add to that, Stalin, as sort of Kevin mentioned, Stalin did already know about the bomb by the time of the Yalta Conference in early 1944. He did know that the United States had in possession a nuclear weapon. But as I said, at the time, no one really knew what such a weapon could do. And I do think that you were right as well, Anthony, by saying that it did demonstrate just the power of such a nuclear weapon. And that's why Stalin was so fascinated after it dropped after the Yalta Conference. He remarked to his high officials, he said, we need to make sure that we start developing one of those immediately.
Right. Well, I think part of it is that, like, Stalin knew about the weapon, but he didn't know that we were going to drop it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Like, he didn't know that we were actually going to use the weapon, and I think it was a good deterrence to say, like, hey. No,
he knew the thing that you're right. He didn't really know that America was going to use it per se, but I think he didn't have intel on inside the White House in that specific context, but I don't think he was surprised because he had all the schematics and everything from Klaus Fuchs and his comrades at Los Alamos that were passing the info. Of course, Philby over in the UK later on that were passing him the info. So he knew exactly what this was going to do. And so when he would have seen what Hiroshima looked like after, he's like, well, they told me it was going to be 15 to 20 kilotons, and it turned out it was about 17, 18 kilotons or whatever. It's like, I don't think that Stalin was that surprised that it was that destructive. I mean, sure, he wasn't a physicist or anything, but he had smart people around him. He had Sakharov, he had Beria, he had these people who they knew what a nuclear weapon was. Their only issue was that they didn't have the production system to really get it going in their country, but they knew basically everything about it by that point.
I think part of it is also to demonstrate like, hey, you better back off, because I know in the Korean Peninsula, the Soviets, they were taking out the Japanese and stuff there, and I think by dropping the nuclear weapons in the global politics kind of perspective, that you kind of demonstrate like, hey, we have weapons, and if you're gonna knock on our influence, we might use this against you. And I think that's what it showed Stalin, be like, hey, whether it be Korea, whether it be West Germany or whatever, we're going to be there, and we're going to have a lot of force when we're going to do something. Because Truman was so anti-communist. I mean, this guy was so crazy anti-communist that like he was willing to threaten, Stalin with nuclear weapons. I mean, that's how much he really hated Joseph Stalin.
Oh, for sure. And here's the thing on that is that people, I've known people that have argued that was one of the reasons why it was wrong, and why it's a terrible argument to defend issuing the nuclear strike against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is that there was a dual incentive. There was an incentive. It was done basically to scare the Soviets. And I'm like, it ended the war. It saved millions. Let's say, okay, I get it. A lot of these people don't care about America. They think America is the worst evil that's ever happened. Let's say you only cared about the Japanese death toll. You know how many millions of Japanese would have died if 5 million Americans died invading their territory? Probably more than 200,000. So let's keep it real on that. He saved Japanese lives in that sense by using them. But it turned out that there was this added bonus of also intimidating the next enemy. I got news, dudes. That's a good thing. That's not a criticism. That's not a reason to not do it. That's more reason to do it. But of course, these people aren't on our side. They're not on our side. They don't see us as the frame of reference. They see anti-imperialism, solidarity with the comrades.
I mean, well, the thing is, the Truman administration was so anti-communist. They were actually kind of close to nuking China at one point. So, like, these people were really anti-communist. I mean, these people wanted to wipe off communism off the face of the earth.
And I gotta say, just as a final point about this, because I know that there's this huge debate about, was it justified or whatnot to use the 2 nukes against Japan? If their high command had refused to surrender until the 36th one, and Truman had 36 devices, I would use 36 devices against Japan. Like, you're in total war. They started it. You don't then get to say, oh, we're done now, but we're not going to do a total surrender. It's like, no, it has to be a total and complete surrender. That's the only acceptable condition. And it took 2 nukes to get there, fortunately, right? It's a good thing that they decided, 2 nukes was bad enough. We're going to do a total surrender now. But let's say they were like, well, we'll do a little bit of a surrender. No, then you keep going and you keep going and you keep going. So the lesson here is, if you don't want to have a bunch of nukes dropped on your head, don't start the war in the first place. So, there needs to be a real deterrent. And that was one of the things that using nukes definitely proved, which is that if they just did the test in the desert and filmed it or whatever, that's not a real deterrent per se. It can be a deterrent. But the credible willingness to use it, that's the deterrent. That's where the power comes from. That's where you can actually get peace in geopolitics, because then people don't want to start stuff. So,
well, I mean,
they know
like I said before, it scares people a little bit, like Stalin. Be like, oh shit, someone actually has a little bit of the upper hand here. Someone is actually using these nuclear weapons. Someone's actually, on par with me. And I think it kind of took Stalin back a little bit. Just be like, oh shit, he can use them. He's got the ability to use them.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I guess I was to some extent kind of misunderstanding the point you were making earlier, because my point was that Stalin wasn't surprised about what it could do, but you're right. I think he was surprised that they were actually willing to use it, because he realized he could have been next. And that was the shock. The Americans thought that the shock for Stalin was like, these things exist. They have this crap. No, the shock for him was he knew what they were. He knew everything about it. He just didn't have the means to produce it on his own yet for 4 years. But the fact that they were willing to use it, that's the pill, right? That's the pill. That's when you realize, like, oh, these guys actually mean business. It's not just fluff. It's not just rhetoric. They're willing to back up their capability with the willingness to use force. Because again, I've talked about this before on the program. Like, you can have the most high-tech advanced capability in the world, but if you don't have the willingness to use it, you'll lose to like people with AK-47s, right? Like if they have the will to fight and you don't. So it's like it was the willingness to use. That's where the real deterrent came from it, and you know, it can be argued that that was one of the reasons why the Red Army didn't continue on, right? Because Stalin wanted all of Europe. It would have been an opportune time to keep going at some point, but the nukes kind of put a stop to that. So
well, that was the earlier point I was trying to make, that like because we used nukes on Japan, Stalin knew that like, oh shit, if I try to take West Germany, they're gonna do the same thing to my soldiers, so I better kind of wheel it back a little bit and just keep East Germany, you know, because if I push into West Germany, Truman's gonna drop the nukes because this guy is actually anti-communist. This guy isn't like FDR. Like this guy's serious. He's
oh yeah, no,
out.
FDR was chummy with Stalin. That's something that gets lost on history, is that FDR wrote, you know, beautiful love letters to Stalin. Churchill was adamant, like, look, we're going to work with him. We're going to give him some aid to help defeat the Nazis, but let's keep it real. After this is all done and over, we should rid the world of him. Whereas FDR was like, oh, well, he fights for workers' rights. And he even had a movie commission called Mission to Moscow. The most disgusting thing Warner Bros. Has ever put out. You watch this and you're like, and I've seen quite a few Soviet films, and you're like, this is a bigger fluff piece for Stalin, literally, than like even the Soviet ones, because at least the Soviet ones had some nuance and some plot development. Whereas this is all, you know, oh, it turns out the wreckers are German agents, and Trotsky is a German agent, and all this, and Stalin is this great hero, but it turns out that there's all these fifth columns within his country, and it was just it was gross, man. What FDR, I mean, I've talked about it before. I'm not much of a fan of FDR personally. I don't like his economics. I think he was chummy with Stalin. However, he at least does get credit for, of course, waging the war against Germany, even though, of course, Germany declared war on America. Let's keep it real.
He did appoint Truman as the VP, which would later be the most anti-communist. So I'll give him credit for that too.
Can I just say that while we're talking about World War II, the Nazis, and the Soviet Union, a brilliant documentary to actually watch on this all is World War II Behind Closed Doors, Stalin, the Nazis, and the West by Lawrence Rees. It's a very good historical documentary that uses archive material that has come from, of course, the end of the Soviet Union and all their top secret documents regarding World War II. It gives you insight of Stalin's relationship with Hitler. It gives you an insight actually into how much, you know, each leader would talk shit about each other, and how much Churchill, for example, hated this sort of infatuation that FDR had for Stalin. Mm-hmm. And you get this. Churchill. Sorry, what was that?
I said I hate Churchill.
Okay.
Wait, you hate Churchill? Okay. No,
you're probably talking about his treatment in India, right? You're talking about how he handled India, or?
Yeah. He
that makes sense.
Did a genocide called the Bengali famine.
Yeah. Okay. When it comes to that, Punjabi, I actually understand you when you say that, actually, because I do tend to agree on some of the points, especially when he's handling of foreign affairs, and he was very much a big imperialist as well when it came to the rest of the world, Churchill. And for example, there's just a lot of stuff that Churchill did wrong. But when it comes to World War II, I do give him credit for actually mobilizing the rest of Great Britain in the defense of, you know, the values of the West, and in the defense against Nazi Germany, and for sort of calling out the Soviet Union when it needs to get called out. So with that, I give him credit for. I can understand the disparities by it. So that's why you got to kind of like remember, with all these figures in history, you got to treat them in the context in which they were in. And you also don't, in other words, pay apologetics for them, I'm saying, but in other words, you treat them as just historical figures. You don't give them a romanticization. You don't give them necessarily this evil disdain or whatever. You treat it as someone examining the historical events, and you allow people to decide for themselves their view of that person or situation.
Okay. And by the way, what did you say gives did you say it gives an account of the Soviets?
Oh, sorry, you mean the documentary?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
What did you say?
Sorry about that. Let me repeat again. So the
Yeah.
documentary is called World War II: Behind Closed Doors: Stalin, the Nazis, and the West, and it's by the historian Lawrence Rees. He's more of a pop historian. I'll give him that. But it's a brilliant documentary series that gives you a behind closed doors look of the Soviet Union during the time of the start of World War II, right up till the end, and just it sort of examines 1938. I believe all the way to 1950, and it tells you the relationships that, for example, how Stalin thought about the war and how he thought about certain individuals. It has reenactments as well. It's quite well made. It also does give sort of an account of what Stalin thought really about FDR and Harry S. Truman and Winston Churchill, and you get really the kind of a very interesting view of these leaders that you've not really seen before, because it's a very realistic approach. You see how cold Stalin was and how little he's actually, you could call him really a psychopath, because he didn't really give a shit about a lot of people. He didn't even give a shit about his own family, for the matter. I remember that I think he jailed his own son, I believe. And he also has well, we could just say he also gets a bit petty at times as well, because he killed thousands of Polish officers, for example, thousands of Polish officers, which, by the way, a lot of people on the sort of on the far left, when a lot of tankies will ignore this, actually, that Stalin killed about 10,000 Polish officers who were during the civil war that happened in the early 1920s that he fought in. He killed these Polish officers years later, and he buried their bodies in the forests in, I think it was in the the east of, I can't remember exactly the location where he buried the bodies, essentially. But he was very cold towards his enemies. He wanted people gone. If you were against Stalin, it's almost like a death sentence, because he would have his agents. That's why, for example, he killed Trotsky after years, because Trotsky was talking shit about him all the way in Mexico. So he sends his agents off to say, okay, go kill that guy now with an ice pick. So this guy was incredibly paranoid, incredibly petty, incredibly psychopathic, actually, as well. That's what Stalin was, and that's why he's probably one of the most brutal figures of World War II and brutal figures of the 20th century.
I do have I have a question for Kevin.
Yep.
Is it true that Stalin slept with like a 14-year-old girl? I've heard this rumor that he had like a really young girlfriend towards the end of his life. Is that true? I've heard this before. What?
The actual truth of the matter is far more disgusting. When Stalin, what we need to understand is that before the Soviet Union was a thing, and the Bolsheviks were agitating against the Tsar, Stalin was sent to Siberia on several occasions. In fact, as the revolution was going on, as I recall, he was still in Siberia, and so he had to get back to Leningrad, or it would have been at the time St. Petersburg. He had to get back there. The thing is that, or rather, Petrograd. He had to get back to Petrograd because he was out in the middle of the Arctic, basically, at a political prisoner camp, that sort of thing. He was exiled by the Tsar. The thing is, for all those years that Stalin was up there in Siberia in exile, he spent his time hunting and fishing, whereas the other communist intellectuals in the Bolshevik movement, like Zinoviev and Kamenev and those guys, they were all writing treatises and exchanging the thoughts on the revolution and all this. And Stalin was like hunting and fishing. And what was he doing? Oh, that's right. Literally having sex with like 12, 13, 14-year-old native Arctic Russian girls, basically. That's what he was doing. And then he comes back to Petrograd just at the same time that all these, intellectuals and stuff come back to Petrograd as the revolution happens. It should be obvious, of course, but and I don't mean to be like the Monday morning quarterback here, right? Because, you never really know how things are going to transpire. But to me, it's not a surprise that he was able to eventually become the leader Because who do we think's going to win at the end of the day? The guy who spends his time writing all these papers and treatises and things, or the guy who's hunting and fishing and just being like a caveman, basically? Because we're talking about Lord of the Flies. Again, this is in the Revolution. Lord of the Flies. Who wins that? I got news, dudes. The most brutal comrade wins that. So the fact that Stalin slept with multiple girls that were under the age of 14 is honestly the least of the problems he did. He's responsible for the deaths of, the better half of 100 million people over the span of his regime, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he killed 10 million people in Ukraine just between 1932 and 1934. And that's just like one notch in his belt. That's just like one little citation there, and he's got 10 million people under his belt. There were some dictators, like the Khmer Rouge with Pol Pot, where he spent all of his time basically thinking about how to kill people and waging a massive percent of the population sending to the killing fields. And he got nowhere close to what Stalin managed to do in, 10% of his reign? No,
Yeah.
Stalin, man. Stalin was something else. So
I would just say that, a lot of people, when it comes to all dictators, they're all equally sort of terrible. However, when you compare, for example, Stalin and Hitler, Stalin objectively had more people killed. However, of course, it's not always about how much people are killed in that, because at the end of the day, Hitler did mechanize essentially industrialize the whole genocide essentially against the Jewish and Gypsy people that cannot be ignored. Now, when it comes to Stalin, it's just a lot of people, I think also a lot of people in the West, they don't actually realize how bad Stalin was. I mean, even as me, I learned how bad Stalin was from Lawrence Rees's book, because Lawrence Rees has a number of books that he's written about World War II and as well as about the Soviet Union, which I do recommend. It always comes back for me is a matter of history, because I'm not here to, point score between either one side. I mean, I could always all acknowledge that they're all dictators and they're all terrible people. And this is why, but the problem is that we've had a lot of this ideological view that has been adopted by a lot of partisan kind of people on the far left and the far right, where they try to idealize these tyrants and they try essentially play apologetics and try to explain, okay, oh no, he did it for this reason, we did it for that reason. They try to play apologetics to the crimes of these tyrants. And it's wrong to do so, because a lot of people, especially in the Soviet Union, suffered under Stalin. They suffered under the Soviet Union as well. Like, it's just even people the reason why, for example, in Poland especially, why there's such a big fascist movement uprising, is sort of this big right-wing white nationalist, almost this kind of neo-fascist movement in the underground of Poland, is because specifically they had over 30 years of Soviet rule. They had over 30 years of Soviet rule, and they hated it. And they honestly, they would like I've heard some people say they would prefer the Nazis over the freaking Soviets. And I don't play apologetics for that. I'm just saying that's some of the statements I've heard. They're all fucking bad to begin with. But even it's just how frightening that how much people's hatred for one side will draw them to the ideological underpinnings of another side, just to face off that side.
I don't want to play apologetics here, but there is a truth that needs to be said, which is that if you are comparing Hitler and Stalin and their regimes, if you're on the in-group of Hitler's regime, you're going to be better off than if you're in the in-group of Stalin's regime. And what do I mean by that? I mean, sure, Hitler purged people like Lang and whatnot, the Night of Long Knives, but for most white Aryan German people, before the war happened or whatever, their standard of living was, in some ways improved under Hitler. Whereas in the Soviet Union, if you were one of the people, the great Russian people that Stalin touted and everything, you had a very high chance of, basically being malnourished, starving, having your standard of living go down even compared to the Tsar era. And so in that sense, communists don't really have an in-group the way that fascists do. Fascists will enslave or kill an out-group and use that to promote the interests of the in-group. Whereas with communists, everybody's an out group. Everybody needs to be purged, basically, at some point. And so that's where that sentiment comes from with some people. I've had friends in the past that have made that argument before, where they'll say things like, well, fascists killed their enemies, whereas communists killed their own. And of course, we can go through so many examples of how fascists killed millions of people in Germany, but as long as you're in the in group, and of course that can change. That's one of the big things with fascism, is it can change at the flip of the leader's whim. But the point there is that in communism, everybody's poor and miserable, whereas in fascism, there's at least this idea that whatever nation you're trying to appeal to, whatever ethnic group you're trying to appeal to, is better off. That's why there's that sort of appeal there. They're both gross. It's just it is objectively true that Stalin did kill more people than Hitler. But
can I just quickly, before the rest of the panel sort of continue, is that I want to just make perfectly clear, and I just want to make this perfectly clear, because there will be idiots in the future, or even idiots maybe who misunderstand right now, is that none of us, especially myself, I'm not playing apologetics for any one regime. I'm thankful that the Soviet Union fell, and I'm thankful that Nazi Germany fell, and I'm glad that these regimes are in the trash bins of history and will remain there, hopefully, as long as we prefer democracy to that. Because the thing is that, democracy is not the most perfect system. We can all argue the fact that, modern democracies are not the most perfect systems. There's still inequality of many different stripes. But again, it's way better than any one of these totalitarian regimes. And it's way better. And they should not, even when it comes to history, we should view these regimes for what they were. And we should go on the basis of the facts of their crimes and for the reasons why they arose and why they were active and why they fell. And that's how we should keep it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I just wanted to say, though, that this sometimes when you bring this up on the Holodomor, when I talked about how Stalin starved Ukrainians to force them into submission and killed about 10 million Ukrainians between 1932 1934, roughly speaking, that is remembered in history, at least Ukrainian history, as the Holodomor, and it's on the same scale of a genocide as the Holocaust was. And yet some people, I went to school with some of these people, for example, that are unironic communists, that the tankies, so to speak. They describe the Holodomor as something that didn't happen. They describe it as, Western liberal bourgeois propaganda, or they'll say, that's just a myth by, sometimes they'll use terms like gay Ukrainians or whatever and whatnot, and they'll use demeaning remarks to refer to Ukrainians in that sense as, oh, they're making it up, they're trying to play for sympathy, which is the same thing that the Holocaust deniers will do with respect to the victims of the Holocaust. It's like, oh, they're trying to get your sympathy or whatever. There's the problem, the big problem that I have is that those apologetics, the Holocaust, not the Holocaust denial, but the Holodomor denial, it actually kind of is a thing in the West still. Like, a lot of people haven't heard about the Holodomor. Some people, communists, are able to downplay it, and they're not challenged on it as forcefully. Like, honestly, if somebody goes out there in a university setting or something and says the Holocaust was overblown, or they do like the Nick Fuentes sort of thing, a lot of people are going to say that that's pretty hateful speech. But there's not much of a discussion around the Holodomor, and to the extent that the discussion happens, you will have supporters of the Soviet Union and legacy of the Soviet Union that will argue, well, it was blown out of proportion, or you're misunderstanding, or in some cases, and Hassan Piker kind of took the mask off on this and said, well, the kulaks deserve to die, that sort of thing. Some people will openly embrace Stalin's talking points on that even today, but that was a real genocide that happened. Stalin, of course, hated Ukrainians. That's a matter of fact. I mean, it's the sort of thing that it kind of gets lost on history. And when we talk about not making apologetics and all this sort of stuff, yeah, we're very clear here that we're not saying that like one side's good or whatever. They're both very bad. I've got a problem, though, in our society with how, if you try to defend the Nazis or whatever, almost everybody's going to look at you and be grossed out and repugnant. But if you try to defend the communists and the Soviet Union, a lot of people are going to be like, oh, he's woke, he's progressive or whatever. It's like, no, just because they were our official ally back then doesn't mean it's okay to defend that regime. Like that's the thing. That's the thing. You can get away with Soviet apologetics today. You can't really get away with Nazi apologetics. And that's a problem. They're both disgusting. And as Anthony pointed out, the Soviets actually kill more people. So it's like, I mean, I'm just sick of the double standard in that sense. I want them both to be held to the same extent. Like the Holodomor should be seen as gross as the Holocaust was. You know, that's my view. So.
I think the other thing too, that it's like, you know, people like Noam Chomsky, like he doesn't like recognize genocides done by like the communists or like these, you know, these really far left socialists or whatever, but he'll recognize like right wing ones, but he won't recognize left wing ones. So he's super partisan.
Oh yeah, Stephen Cohen too. Stephen Cohen has played apologetics for the Holodomor. He's played apologetics for Stalin before. He's definitely played apologetics for Putin. Now, of course, Putin hasn't done like a genocide anywhere near the scale of the stuff that we're talking about. But the point is, you can get away. You can still have a career in academia and be an apologist for the Holodomor. You can't have a career in academia and be an apologist for the Holocaust. Yet, the Holocaust killed about 1 million more people than the Holodomor did. So it's like, they're on the same scale of brutality. I'm just sick of the Soviet Union and just communism in general as being seen like oh, it's different or it's somehow better. Like if somebody tells me that they're an unironic communist, I'm not going to see that any differently than if they tell me that they're an unironic Nazi, you know? So there are different strands. There are some idealists. There are some idealist communists out there. There are also some idealist fascists out there. There are different strands in both movements. If you tell me you're a communist or if you tell me that you're a Nazi, I'm going to think of you the same way. So that's my view.
Can I just say, before Punjabi speaks, sorry, I just want to quickly say something quickly. I want to just say that Putin loves to play apologetics over Stalin, and I think you mentioned this already, but he likes to play apologetics over Stalin to such an extent that he'll revise history. And I just was reading a tweet recently where Stalin tried to imply that it was Poland or something that took parts of Czechoslovakia, and it was essentially, he's implying basically that it was Poland's fault, and that what happened to Poland was sort of what it got, you know, there was sort of how can I say it, they got it coming to them, or something of the implication. And it was just during Victory Day. And I know that essentially Putin does deny, Putin, I should say, omits the fact that the Russians had a Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, as Punjabi mentioned a bit earlier, between themselves over Poland that divided up Poland. So I found that his apologetics is a bit worrying because he's combined that ideology of Tsarism, Stalinism, with his own quasi-brand of Putinism into this sort of weird concoction for the modern-day Russia. So I think Punjabi wants to say something now. I'll let him speak.
Sorry. Okay, but like, what if someone is a communist, like considers them a communist because they identify with the ideas of Karl Marx, and but they don't engage in apologetics for the Soviet Union or Mao's China or any other brutal communist regime. Would you still have the same feeling about that? Like, even if they condemn all of those authoritarian communist governments.
So you're basically asking about the image that I'm about to bring up right now, because this is basically how I think about these people right here. You know, true communism was never tried. The people who say, yeah, it was tried 63 times, but if you put my plan into vision, it'll be different. Just give me the power. Those types of people basically is what you're referring to. They think it'll be different, the idealists, so to speak. I've talked about this on the program before, but of course, not everybody's watching at all times, so I'll make it clear again. This is my view on that. I actually have more respect for the tankies than I do for the idealists in the communist movement, because at least the tankies are honest salesmen. Like, the tankies will tell me straight up, they're like, if we get power, bro, we're going to shoot you and call you a kulak. Whereas the idealists tell me, well, if you give us power, everything will be utopian and great, bro. So just trust us. And then look at what winds up happening. And so my view on that is it would be exactly the same as if you asked me about, well, what about a fascist apologist, or not apologist, but what about a fascist idealist who dissociates themselves from Hitler and thinks that Hitler wasn't true fascism or whatever? My response would be, they might honestly think that, but their worldview is so misguided, and their understanding of human nature is so misguided, that they're willing to sell you this pipe dream, this utopian vision, to just, let's do Lord of the Flies, get away from the rule of law and liberal democracy. But it's okay, trust me, because we'll have a utopian system. No, I got news, dude. It's like my law. If there's a law in politics that I can coin, it's that the most brutal comrade always prevails. And so, who here thinks that idealist is going to be the one who wins the power struggle? Nobody. It's going to be a Stalin type bro who's out there hunting and fishing and fucking 13-year-olds in the woods. That's the guy who's going to become the great leader of the party, not these intellectual soy boys who are going to be rounded up and shot by the great leader for getting in the way of his power. That's how this system goes. And so those idealists, they will pave the road to hell with good intentions, and they will sell you a utopian vision of the future. And they are nothing but misguided and naive merchants of death. And if we put our faith and trust in them, we are condemning our civilization, our people, our family, our neighbors to, at best, misery, and at worst, a mass grave. So that's my view on these people. They are filth. That's my view.
Okay, so I have a somewhat different view to Kevin. If they don't play apologetics to these totalitarian regimes, I consider them as sort of like, I may disagree with their ideology, and I may not necessarily support it, but I don't have, at the end of the day, if they're respecting the laws of the land and that they don't really play apologetics for these tyrannies and they just sort of go about their daily business, I don't really care that much. I mean, for example, I do support people about the Rojava project, and that is largely libertarian socialists, and there are communists that also support that as well. And there's a lot of conservatives that also support that as well. But again, like, I don't really support, for example, the Marxist-Leninists or their ideological view, as they sometimes don't have a sort of a view based on reality. It's like, again, also, if it came to the Nazis who, like, I guess, disrespect, not disrespect, who don't care much for Hitler's tyranny, or who speak out against Hitler's tyranny, as long as they, I guess, respect the government of the day, the terms of the laws, they're allowed to have their opinion, but I won't agree with it. And I hope it never gets taught actually in schools unless I'm very, like, from the same, my views are essentially, I'm a liberal, I'm like a social liberal. I'm close to a progressive. I have leanings towards the left, and I'm mostly in the center, but I've got leanings towards the right when it comes to foreign policy. So I don't necessarily mind those people. I don't have a problem with those people as long as they respect the rule. But at the moment, they, of course, step that boundary where they start to want to actively pursue their ideology, and they actually sort of try to destabilize the government or some sort, then that becomes a different matter. But again, it's like the same with libertarians and any other ideology that I disagree with. As long as they are, like, in their own little circles, basically, they're following the rules, they have their own little clubs, they can talk about this stuff too, they can all write papers to one another, they can all sort of masturbate each other's ideology. Yeah, that's fine, just as long as they don't teach it in schools, and as long as it's not, against the laws of the government, then I'm pretty much I'm okay with that.
Yeah. I should clarify my position on this. I'm not obviously saying that those people that are, like, say, call themselves idealized communists or whatever should, like, be arrested or anything. It's just my kind of point with this stuff is that their ideology would necessarily be outside of the rule of law that we have in our system right now. And so my issue is that if their ideas were to ever gain traction, they would lead us down the road into the descent into darkness. And so, because there are fascists out there that are not too big of a fan of Hitler, they'll talk about how Hitler screwed up the war effort, how Hitler betrayed Germany, all this sort of stuff. They would have done things differently. And you've got, of course, people that would say, well, if they were in charge, they would have done things differently than Stalin on the left wing side of it. My thing with all of that is that it's not that these people themselves are like responsible for like huge murder or anything. My point is just that if their ideologies got traction, they have the potential to bring upon untold hell to us. And so we need to be wary of that. And in that sense, I mean, it's really the sort of thing that ideas do matter. And I worry with those sorts of things when we start to say, well, it's okay to believe in the theory that resulted in all this mass murder and everything, as long as you dissociate yourself from the mass murder. Because in my view, the mass murder wouldn't have been possible without Marxism. Like, imagine if the Tsars tried to do what Stalin did. In 1,000 years of the Tsars, they never managed the death toll that Stalin did over the entire millennium, because they simply didn't have the ideological mechanism to do the death that Stalin did on that scale. Russia always had a big population, right? But Ivan the Terrible was a horrible guy, for example. He would have been happy to do it, but they didn't have the ideology. That type of ultra-conservative, bourgeois, so to speak, theocracy of the Tsars. That's not that kind of ideology that would have worked that way. But communism, on the other hand, is a much more modern ideology that has the mechanisms there to dehumanize in a way that Orthodox Christian Tsarism never could hope to do. I mean, and they killed a lot of people, but it wasn't the same scale. Lenin had more people rounded up and shot in one night than the Tsars did in a decade, for example. So communism is a very potent and dangerous tool if you want to kill a lot of people very quickly. And so
I just want to quickly
it was the idealists that brought us Stalin. It was Zinoviev and Kamenev, for example, that got him on the board, or that got him into power in the first place. And they of course were rewarded for it by being rounded up and shot in the basement of the Vladimir prison, because Stalin viewed them as a threat.
Can I just say as well that actually I probably should a bit refine or just a tad bit revise what I said earlier, because actually it's kind of remind me, because if I say the stuff I said, it kind of is a gateway to other ideologies that are extremes. If I say, for example, that I'm okay with as long as they respect the laws and stuff and they don't really adhere to the tyrannies and they're not teaching them, I'm fine with them. Actually, that's not exactly correct, because I'm against, for example, the Islamists. I'm against the jihadists. And a lot of them are working underground, and a lot of them, for example, they do technically kind of respect, quote unquote, the laws of society, but at the end of the day, their ideology is completely reprehensible. So I would actually say that the notion of a classless society, so a society whereby we can have, be without the sort of class structure where people can live in harmony, it sounds good in theory, but the methodology by which to get there is usually flawed, and that's why it will never be implemented in any sense of the word properly, quote unquote, to these people, because again, their vision is that it can never lead to a classless society. Therefore, it's not communism, which is it's almost like what is it?
No true Scotsman sort of thing.
No true Scotsman fallacy, basically, because it's like it goes back to Karl Popper when it comes to why Marxism is not for example, a scientific theory, or that is because it can't be falsified. You actually can't prove it wrong, and the reason why you can't prove it wrong is the same with like religion and that. You can't prove these ideologies wrong, because by their whole makeup, they are just essentially, they'll say that any version that's been tried or that's bad, a bad aspect of their ideology is not a part of their ideology. So you can't actually disprove these things. You can't even prove them either by that extent. That's why we don't take these things, I guess, seriously. So I would say that for example, when we're teaching the ideologies of communism or Nazism, it has to be a staple that we have to mention the crimes of different communist governments, and we have to mention why, for example, these ideologies are, whether they be Nazism when it comes to anti-Semitism or the sort of Aryan ideology, why these ideologies are bad, or why, for example, we have to have a critical thinking process of these ideologies. We shouldn't, for example, burn books or deny people from reading books, because I'm against that. What we should do instead is teach people critical thinking skills by which they have the tools to assess these ideologies and to actually understand why, for example, communism has not worked, and why, for example, communism has actually led to widespread suffering amongst peoples. So we have to teach that. So I think my thing again is that certain ideologies are morally reprehensible, and we need to equip our people with the skills to sort of be able to identify those ideologies, as well as the reasons for why they are terrible, for reasons why they exist. Okay.
Oh, no, absolutely. Absolutely. That's the big thing there, is that that's a common factor with all these regimes, is that they despise critical thinking. They did everything in their power to limit the extent that people could critically think, because it would undermine the legitimacy of their regime and their grip on power. And on the last point that I'll make about the idealism sort of thing, Bukharin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, all these guys, they didn't have it in their head, oh yeah, we're going to kill like 60 million people, give us power. They were all idealists, sharing what might sound to, to some people to be, oh, a classless society, justice for workers, all this sort of stuff. And what happened to all of them? They rallied around Lenin. Lenin butchered millions of people in the Civil War, and then they had the power struggle between Trotsky and Stalin. They sided with Stalin because they were very scared about Trotsky. They were terrified about Trotsky because they saw what he did in the Civil War, and they were like, he might kill us if we give him power. So they sided with Stalin. Stalin promised them that if they voted for him, that he would spare them. They voted for him, and then the days go by. Oh, it turns out Comrade Stalin has revoked his promise. Now we're going 6 feet under. So those were all idealists. Those were all the people that would fall under this category of, they meant well. Yeah, they meant well, and 60 million people died. That's not good enough. That's not an excuse. It's not enough to say, I mean well, therefore let's try out my ideology. I mean, I get it. If you're respecting the law and whatever, you're not agitating, you're not going out there and trying to win other people over. You just happen to believe this stuff, but you don't tell anybody about it. Okay, that's fine, But if you're out there trying to turn other people into communists, I have a problem with it, because if you do that, I believe that every individual matters, and if you do that to enough people, eventually, maybe the revolution does happen, and then maybe another 60 million or more people die. And so, to me, it's just too risky. And so, to me, it's intolerable to allow this type of extremism to really fester without going unchallenged. So.
Well, I think actually, for me, if I think Reese pointed this out too. It's like, can we just be center left or center right? Can we just stay away from the extreme ideologies altogether? I mean, because like a lot of these extremist people, a lot of it's very situational, and actually I know some people have talked about this on Twitter too. Like, some people were full blown commies during the recession of 2008. But some people were able to pull out of that ideology. So I think some of these ideologies are a bit more situational. It's just like, guys, just be reasonable with politics, compromise, get along, concede to some concessions with people. Don't go to any of the extremes. Just be realistic, and just vote, guys. Don't stay away from this crap from both sides.
Yes,
the communities behind these are too toxic. It's okay to be a liberal. It's okay to be center right. It's okay.
Yeah.
They're not bad things, because in the
it's
real
okay
world,
to be center left.
Yeah, it's okay.
Like, that's the thing. Like, for me, I call myself, I used to call myself more of a centrist, but especially on economics and stuff, I'm more kind of center right these days. But I got nothing. I mean, I could get into arguments and stuff, but I don't really have anything fundamentally against people that are on the center left. I mean, this even goes for people that are like, say for example, like somebody like Tony Blair. He's like center left and whatnot. I've got a lot of respect for him, and it's like, because the spectrum of normalcy is the spectrum of respectability is center left to center right. Like, that you got people on the center right that kind of go up to where kind of Ben Shapiro is, and you got people on the center left that kind of go right up to around where Elizabeth Warren is. And you got like, Elizabeth Warren to, this is in the American context at least, Elizabeth Warren to Ben Shapiro, and everybody in between is okay. They're not calling for like big executions of landlords or Jews or anything. But once you go outside of that level, that's where things start to get, dog whistles start to happen. Or you go further in one direction and then people are mask off. Like, yeah, I want to kill the landlords, like Hassan. Or on the right, you've got like, oh, I want to deport all non-whites, like this type of stuff. It's like there's a spectrum of normalcy where, like, of course, Ben Shapiro and Elizabeth Warren are going to disagree on a lot of stuff. But at the end of the day, they're both normal people. Right, in my sense of things, but of course, if you say that from one perspective, like if you say you're on the center left, but you have respect for people that are on the center right, people will say, "Oh, well, then you're a right winger." Or if you're on the center right, and I've had this happen on Twitter before, and I'll like say somebody that I like who's on the left, and I'll be like, "Yeah, that's because you're a leftist," and it's like, what? I mean, why can't we just have it so that you can admire qualities, or you can give compliments to people that are on the other side of the aisle, but that aren't totally batshit crazy? You know what I'm saying? Like what you were talking about, right?
Well,
so
I just wanted to also say that when it comes also to these ideologies, we can talk about certain aspects of these ideologies, whether it be about historical materialism when it comes to communism, or Hegelian dialectics. We can have sort of aspects of these ideologies that are up for debate, and we can have civil discussion over them, and we can sort of stretch out the nuances of such positions in that, or even understanding what these positions are. But again, when it comes to these ideologies as a whole and their proponents, most times, and we've seen when it comes to the Islamists and jihadists, or whether the communists, or even when to the Nazis or neo-Nazis, they end in a lot of suffering for people. And that's why they must be opposed, because a lot of the time for our democracies to progress, and if we do it through reform, and reform, in my opinion, since I'm, I guess, a moderate in this sense, reform is the best way you actually repair and fix democracies. You refine the methodology by which democracy, at least modern democracies, are active. And you do it this way. That way you can make better, quote unquote, democracies than before, because you have elements that you take that are good, get rid of the bad. And that's how it is, because that's how society should be. It should be always reforming. The reason why radical approaches, sort of like radical revolution, usually always end up usually more negative than before, is that people have this vision that they want to implement, okay? Like in the case of Lenin, he wanted to implement Marxist theory to Russian society and an agricultural society. What he did is he revised some of Marxist ideology in order and made it his own, i.e. Leninism, and applied it to the context of Russia. And we saw what happened eventually is you have this this group that represents the proletariat, his party mainly. And you see how that eventually leads to the consolidation of power by Stalin, and actually opens the gateway really to the mass scale of suffering in Russia. And I believe that, as Kevin mentioned, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. A lot of these people, I'm sure, had good intentions when they're writing this, whether it be Marx or whatever. They probably had some good intentions where they thought that, okay, if they apply this ideology, it would work to help lift people out of suffering and poverty and wide-scale slavery or indentured servitude, or whatever you want to call it. I'm sure they had all these good intentions. But again, as we saw when it came to these different regimes, that led down to hell. And that's why, just because your intention may be good, the methodology by which you achieve it needs to be put always in question, and that the real good approach to take is to refine and reform, as that way we have a much more broader scope where we can actually see, okay, what works, what doesn't work, how can we actually apply this practically into society, and what will be the benefits of that pragmatism when we apply it to society, because that's how you get the best systems that work. That's why, for example, when it comes to labor rights and the rights of workers and like that, that's some good elements that came out of really the socialist box. But that came, of course, through various concessions made to the more capitalist blocks and the more right-wing blocks. So we have to remember that. And this is why, for example, now, like in Australia, we have like a social welfare system, or I guess in Canada, we have a social welfare system and like that. It's because there was some form of concessions and some form of give and take that was applied. And that's what I mean, is that we can actually get the best elements of these ideologies if we do it through discussion, through debate, through reform, through refining, through criticisms, and so forth. what usually happens, as I mentioned before, when it comes to revolution, you usually get the worst elements that come out because it's a radical change that has really no long-term longevity in that.
No, absolutely. And I just want to kind of make a point about that. The critics would accuse that of being incrementalist or whatnot, but at the end of the day, let's keep it real. The system that Karl Marx, the points where Karl Marx in a lot of his writings are accurate at the time in 1848 and around that era. He never predicted that the trade unionist movement would actually bring a lifting of standard for labor without having to resort to a revolution, right? And so I know that a lot of like tankies and stuff, they hate the trade unionists because they see them as a compromise with capitalism. But let's keep it real. Even poor unionized workers in America are better off than any of the workers were in the Soviet Union under Stalin or under Lenin. And so at the end of the day, that it was that compromise there that kind of resulted in, you can kind of think of like, this blend around the center that resulted in, the best prosperity that's ever been developed in human history. And it's just, there's something though, just on the good intentions thing that is a bit of nuance that I think we do need to mention here, but we will be wrapping up the stream around the 2-hour mark in about 10 to 15 minutes or so. So we'll go to final remarks soon, but just to give everybody a heads up. But on the good intentions thing, I have seen the argument made before, but you can't even give that argument about the far right or the fascists or anything. And I think that that's not a good way of looking at it, because the people around Hitler, Mussolini, those guys and their associated theorists and stuff, they really thought that they were going to make Germany great. Like, they didn't see themselves as bad guys. They thought that they were the heroes of their story. In other words, they also thought that they had good intentions and everything. And of course, they made it a hell even for their own country, because, of course, look at Germany before Hitler and look at Germany after Hitler. Even if you didn't care about the rest of the world, you're a nationalist or something, didn't work out very well for the German people. And so there is a fascist equivalent to that too. And it bothers me when people will say, yeah, but and we had this happen with that debate with Millsrow, where he tried to argue that, or it wasn't Millsrow, rather, it was Cogent Canine, where Cogent Canine tried to argue that at least the ideal of communism is good, whereas the ideal of fascism is bad. And in my problem with that is that that's coming from a bias of somebody who's on the left wing in his case, because to somebody who's like on the center right, or not necessarily the center right, but like somebody who's on the far right, they're going to see the ideals of fascism as better than the ideals of communism. And so the reality of both is horrible, and the ideals of both are horrible, because they both result in the stepping outside of the bounds of reason. And just on the radicalism, once you say incrementalism is too slow for my taste, let's do a revolution, let's do Lord of the Flies so that we can get things through very quickly. The problem is, guess who wins Lord of the Flies? It's the dude who's out hunting and fishing and having sex with like 12-year-olds. It's not the dude who's spending his time in a cafe memorizing Marx and thinking deeply on the theory. Stalin didn't really care too much for reading himself. And guess who won power? It was Stalin, because the most brutal comrade always wins. I mean, Pol Pot, he wasn't very well educated. Mao, I mean, even Stalin's guys, when they saw Mao, they were like, okay, I know he's a useful ally, but he's really dumb and he doesn't really know anything about communism. How is he supposed to be the leader of the communist movement? So they kind of taught him some of the basics and stuff, and he had this general idea, but he had never even really read Marx or anything. It was not the intellectuals in those movements that won at the end of the day, except in some cases. I mean, Lenin, and this is another point of nuance. Let me be very clear here. If an intellectual does win, also millions of people will die too, because Lenin was very smart. Lenin was a smart guy. He was a lawyer. He was a journalist. He was very good at writing. He definitely thought deeply on the theories, and he still butchered millions of people. So an intellectual can also be the most brutal comrade. Let's keep it real. So that's kind of what I got to say on the subject. But we're going to go to final remarks. We'll start with Curious Punjabi. Feel free to speak on any thoughts that you got.
Well, this has been an interesting discussion. I do find that the saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Though I find, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I have read in history class, before the Nazis came to power in Germany, the communists in Germany and the social democrats of Germany were at each other's throats, and which it was part of the reason why Hitler came to power. And also, in my opinion, the only types of socialism that really make sense to me, this is just my view, people are more than happy to disagree with me, are Rojava type of democratic confederalism and pre-World War II Catalonia type of anarcho-syndicalism.
Okay. Yeah, we'll have to do another stream on that. I find the case for Rojava to be a lot more convincing personally. I think the Catalonia case is definitely an issue for another stream. I know that there's a lot of evidence pointing there to how anarchy will never be able to ward off fascism because, of course, the fascists wound up taking over, and so that's my view. There is that it's not a sustainable system, but you know, I don't want to go into like a long debate here because we got to keep the stream around 2 hours so that I can do these every day. But you know, I appreciate your perspective and you know, thank you for coming on the program. And you know, we'll have to have another discussion on that at some point. And so. With that, we're going to go to Anthony Avistu-Bisson. Thank you for coming on the program tonight and your closing remarks.
Okay, thank you for having me as always on, Kevin. I just wanted to say that this was a good discussion on especially Stalinism, Nazism, and the pitfalls essentially of both ideologies and the history of Stalin's brutality towards his own people. I want to say that it would be interesting to do a stream actually on Rojava. I would, of course, would definitely be on that stream if it does happen anytime soon. It would be good to have a conversation on that, but that we'll save that for another matter because I have my own thoughts on that and the complexities regarding that project. But yeah, when it comes to just my thoughts in general, I've always been, over time, the more I read about history, the more I understand that revolutions usually never work. Even most revolutions that come about, even when it comes to, let's even take a little bit of the Rojava stuff, it becomes more pragmatic over time, especially if it wants for its longevity. There's a pragmatic element that comes into play where there's actually a moderation of the revolution, especially for those situations whereby, you know, if the revolution does come about, it will either go two directions or either moderate, which is usually the rare occasion, or it will, of course, go more totalitarian and eventually collapse in itself in a couple of decades, as we saw with the Russian Revolution, the failures of that revolution. So we have to understand that in all the best case, the longevity of any project comes with moderation, reform, and refinement, whereby you have that system always adjusting and always getting out the negatives and putting in the positives and really adjusting to the times that it is in. Because we always forget when it comes to any of these political systems, we forget that external matters also matter when it comes to the progress of these projects. So there'll be external matters, whether it be natural disasters or invasions or whatever you want to call it. So we have to just keep that in mind. And I always believe that to be a moderate and to actually think of these things in terms of small changes over time is better than to be a radical and think of it as radical change, because often at times the radical change doesn't really do what the person who's advocating it thinks it will do. It often actually does the reverse at times. So those are my thoughts. Thank you again for having me, Kevin. Thank you to Punjabi, and thank you to Anthony. And you all have a good day.
Yeah, no, thanks for coming on, Anthony. When you messaged in the chat earlier and said, send the link, I'm like, oh, well, that'll be interesting, because originally it was probably just going to be Curious Punjabi and Anthony Roberto and myself, but your perspective is definitely valued here. Very, very interesting conversation so far. And I mean, we've got our disagreements and things, of course, and our different perspectives. But, I think the synthesis of kind of what we were really getting at there is that there's a spectrum of I guess sanity or civility in a way, where you can move in one direction or another direction, but as long as it's within that spectrum, it's not going to result in the tremendous horrors that we saw in the 20th century. But that when you go outside of that spectrum, that's where things get very, very dangerous. And it's a broad spectrum for sure. And of course, people that are on like the center right, you often see them use hyperbole and call people on the center left, full communists and stuff. And then you'll see people on the center left call people on the right, fascists and things. But at the end of the day, there's still this agreement or this acknowledgement of things like the Constitution, the judicial process, these sorts of things that are around. Once you go outside of that, that's where things can get dangerous. But thanks to Anthony for coming on. We're going to go to Anthony Roberto for your closing remarks, and then we'll go to my closing remarks, and then we'll close out the stream.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole discussion was good. If you want to talk about Catalonia and Rojava, we can definitely have another stream on that. I can make materials for that. And I'll say this too. I mean, I think especially with the Victory Day or whatever in Russia, with how they portray it, and how we in the West portray it too, and the whole like Nazi Germany and World War II. I mean, I think it is good discussion. I think it's like, I understand like you shouldn't, I guess, celebrate using a nuclear weapon, but it's like Russia, Belarus, and some of these other countries, they get to parade how they won World War II, but we can't. Like, are you serious? So like I've always found that kind of dumb, and it's like we really can't say anything about it. Like, no, like our country, Canada, the Britain and other Western powers, they all made a lot of sacrifice, even if it was civility. Sure, I mean, maybe it was not the same though, but I'm sure in Canada you guys had food rations and stuff like that during World War II. So everyone had a part to play in World War II, whether if you're in the factories or whatnot. And I think one thing when it comes to the stream is that it's like the tactics that were used between the Soviets and the Nazis were obviously horrible, obviously like absolutely awful. But again, the people in the West also sacrificed a lot too, and I think it's important to understand that people from the Western countries, they were there to at least try to bring the world into a more freer state, whereas the Soviets didn't. The Soviets weren't trying to make people get better opportunities, weren't trying to expand freedom or liberty at all. They weren't. The U.S. and its allies were, and I think that's a really good important distinction. It's like, yes, they're against the Nazis, but just because you're inherently against the Nazis doesn't necessarily make you a better person or anything like that. So I think that's how I'll close off. And as always, thanks, Kevin, for letting me have you on your stream.
Yeah, no, thanks for coming on, Anthony. It's a really interesting stream tonight, and I'll of course be back here tomorrow at 9 p.m. Pacific, 12 a.m. Eastern. I'm just going to go to my closing remarks here. I really don't have too much to say. I kind of, I spoke a fair bit tonight. We had a bit of a longer intro on my end. I had a lot of things to say, but the stream in that sense, my thoughts there speak for themselves. To kind of just wrap this up, I'll say that on the theme of things, of course, because the stream is, the title of it is about, don't be fooled. Fascist Russia is your enemy. Like, that's you at home. right? You might make apologetics. You might think that Putin isn't too bad. Maybe you've got criticisms of the West. But I got news. Putin's practicing nuking your hometown, and he doesn't care really that, oh, you're on his side, because when that nuke goes off, if he fires that nuke, you're going to be vaporized just as all the degenerate Westerners. Nukes don't distinguish like that. You are a target to Russia just as we are, except at least the Russians will respect the pro-Westerners in the West, because at least they can recognize patriotism, and Putin at least respects people that are loyal to their own countries and their own civilizations, even if they're opponents, right? They don't respect useful idiots. They actually think lesser of you if you're supporting Putin than they do of people like me, because at least they say, well, he's a Westerner, he supports the West, we can respect that. But they don't like traitors very much, and we don't like traitors, and so I don't like traitors, and so you're not really winning anybody by selling out the West to be edgy, to win brownie points with Putin, because Putin thinks you're a schmuck. And so, to make my final point here, as I was talking about, and as we were kind of discussing with the panel about this spectrum, about how you can kind of range from the center left, the center, to the center right, where everybody kind of agrees on fundamental things like democracy and human rights and stuff like that. You just have like a disagreement over social issues or economics and stuff, but you're not going to do a revolution or a putsch or anything, like the far right or the far left would. That idea of the spectrum of normalcy, the center right to the center left, that spectrum, both sides agree that the West is worth preserving and defending and is a good thing. They just disagree on the direction that the West should go in. But those center left, center right, conservatives, liberals, right, within that spectrum, they all want to reform the West in their own direction, but they still see the West as worth putting the effort into. There is another spectrum, and you can say, well, isn't it divided? Isn't it kind of split? Isn't it like there's this big gap between them? Well, it's the far left and the far right. They are also a spectrum there, and sure, they cross over, but I think of it as a circle. You got to keep in mind, I envision the political spectrum not as this bar where there's this big gap in between the two. I think of it as a circle, with the center left to the center right being the top of the circle, with the center at the top, and then the far left and the far right the bottom of the circle, and they're right next to each other. And so there's a spectrum there and a spectrum at the top. The spectrum at the bottom of the extremes, that spectrum doesn't think that the West is worth preserving. That spectrum views the West as bourgeois or degenerate, or any number of dog whistles that you could get out there. That spectrum sees siding with an enemy as better, or doing a revolution as better, or doing a putsch as better than what we're doing now. And this is famously exemplified by Nick Fuentes saying, give me full Stalinism, give me full communism over what we're doing now. And he's on the far right, but he's, getting right along there with far left communists. And so in this case, as these things relate to what I was talking about the legitimization of Putin, Putin doesn't like one spectrum in our civilization. That's, of course, the center left to the center right. He doesn't like them. He doesn't like them at all, because even though he might have more in common with, say, the center right on social issues and stuff, he doesn't like our center right, because our center right is pro-Western, and he doesn't like that. He sees us as the enemy, and so he doesn't get along with them. He actually gets along with the far left here better than he does our center right, because, of course, the far left and the far right both agree that Putin is based and red-pilled and tragcon or whatever, the savior of sorts, whether you're looking at it from a materialistic sort of standpoint, or a spiritual standpoint, a fascistic standpoint, an anti-imperialist standpoint. Those ideologies both are in his good graces in that sense. And so Putin likes the far left here, and he likes the far right here. He doesn't like the center left here, and he doesn't like the center right here, and he doesn't like the centrist here. He likes our extremes. And think about it. He's somebody who's socially conservative. On economics, you can argue somewhere kind of like a Soviet system, kleptocratic. He's got some right-wing elements, some left-wing elements there, but you could chalk him up to be kind of a right-wing guy at the end of the day. So why would he like the far left? Well, he likes the far left and the far right here because at the end of the day, he doesn't even care who wins. He doesn't care if it's the alt-right or Antifa that prevail because both of them bring chaos. And he doesn't care who wins here because they're still the enemy. He just wants us to be weakened and divided. And if he ever got the chance to take us over, he'd have whoever was helping him out, dividing us, making us weak, he'd have them rounded up at the end of the day so that he could have absolute power. They're useful idiots. He has no respect for them. But to close this out, fascist Russia is our enemy. And I just hope, my hope is that for those of you who might be on the fence, or for those of you who might be on the other side of things and actually fall in that spectrum, I want you to realize that you're getting played, and that your house, your apartment, is just as much a target to fascist Russia as mine is. And if that war were to happen, they'd send the same nuke at me as they would at you, you know, if you live near me, for example. And so you defending him, playing apologetics for him isn't going to save you from his wrath. And so my point here is that the lesson that we can take away from this is that we should be ardent defenders of the West. The West is worth preserving, and that anybody who falls within that spectrum, we can have a debate, we can have disagreements, but at the end of the day, we're on the same side in the grand scheme of things. And so we welcome a big tent of pro-Westerners at the end of the day. And so with that, thank you to the guests. Thank you for everybody in the chat for being here. Thank you for the viewers. And have a good night, everybody. I'll be back here tomorrow. Peace.
Peace.